The federal government is in the process of trying to pass Bill C-7, which will expand the parameters around medical assistance in dying or MAID. Assisted suicide advocates are applauding this move, but a number of groups representing people with disabilities are raising red flags. Joining me now to discuss this in more detail is Alex Schadenberg, Executive Director of Euthanasia Prevention Coalition, joining me from London, Ontario. Welcome back to Bridge City News, Alex.
It's great being with you again today.
Now, assisted suicide has been legal in Canada for a number of years now. What exactly will Bill C-7 change?
Yeah, so Bill C-14 legalized euthanasia and assisted suicide, which they now like to call medical aid in dying, just to make us all feel better. That was legalized in June of 2016. So what Bill C-7 does is it changes the law by, first of all, it refers to this Quebec court decision, which struck down the requirement of the law that your natural death be reasonably foreseeable. That was the terminal illness requirement in the law. And so what it does is it says that that has to come out of the law, but that was never defined before. So what it means is people who are not terminally ill could die by euthanasia or assisted suicide. And I first should explain what the difference is. Euthanasia is death by lethal injection, whereas assisted suicide is the same type of death, but you do it yourself. They give you the drugs and you do it yourself. So the first thing is taking away the terminal illness requirement. The second thing they've done is they've taken out the waiting period or the reflection period. The original law had a 10-day reflection or waiting period within a law. This bill, if passed, will allow a same-day death. So if the doctor determines that you are terminally ill and you have a bad day, you could die that very same day. So that if you had a bad day and you die by euthanasia, you'll never see the better day that could be the next day. Won't happen, you'll be dead. The other thing it does is it creates this two-track law. So therefore, if you're not dying, you would wait 90 days. But if you are dying, there'd be no waiting period. So it creates this 90-day waiting period for people who are not terminally ill. So someone who might have a significant health condition or psychological suffering could request euthanasia, be approved for it, but then die in 90 days, whereas someone who's considered terminally ill could die immediately.
Now, a number of groups who advocate for those with disabilities, Alex, say this is something that will create more vulnerability for them. How will Bill C-7 do that?
Well, by removing the natural death as reasonably foreseeable, that meant that terminal illness restriction, the law then allows euthanasia for physical or psychological suffering. Now, the law never defined psychological suffering, and it never actually defined physical suffering either. So what it does is the people with disabilities are saying this law will now allow someone who has a physical or a psychological condition, and whether it be it doesn't need to be terminal to die by euthanasia. Now, you have to understand the perspective here. We've had several cases already of people who were not necessarily dying, who had significant disabilities but not dying, who were urged to consider euthanasia. There was the case of Roger Foley, for instance, here in London, Ontario. Roger Foley has a significant degenerative condition, but he was being pressured by the hospital here in London, Ontario, to die by euthanasia. And the reason is because his needs were so great that he needed a significant amount of home care to move home. And the province was saying they weren't going to offer him that. So therefore, the doctors were saying, in order to get him out of the hospital, let's ask him about euthanasia. There's these kind of things. But also there was the case of Candace Lewis in Newfoundland. Candace Lewis went to the doctor when she was 25. She was significant disabilities. She was very sick at the time. All that is true. But the doctor was pressuring her to euthanasia. Now you have the case where you don't even have to be terminally ill. So in the case of Roger Foley, he was not technically terminally ill, but his condition could be terminal if he had no treatment, right? Now that wouldn't even matter. People with disabilities are saying, well, we're already treated in a negative manner. This makes it worse. There's another point of the bill also. Currently, the law requires two people to be how would you say, unrelated witnesses. So therefore, someone requesting euthanasia, there would need to be two unrelated witnesses, which is like all other legal documents. If I sign a will, it needs to be then signed also by two unrelated witnesses. Well, what they're doing is they're going to reduce that to one, and it could be someone who's even your nurse or your caregiver. So people with disabilities are talking about, well, many people with disabilities go through a situation where they feel coerced in their life, they feel pressured in their life, they feel controlled in their life, they feel they have a lack of ability to make decisions because of how their life circumstance is. And now you're going to have euthanasia could be approved by your your caregiver or your nurse, they feel that's completely unsafe. And I would agree with them.
Let me ask you something. Wouldn't that be considered unethical, though, for a doctor, hospital to put pressure on a patient to end their own life?
Well, certainly it was unethical. Roger Foley, in the case of him in London, Ontario, recorded the conversation on a tape recorder because he was so upset and shocked by the fact that they were telling him he should die by euthanasia. They were saying to him, "Well, you can have euthanasia, or it's going to cost you $1,800, you know, per month to live here." And he's like, "Well, what kind of option you offer me, death or paying for my hospital bed, when the province is saying they're not going to care for me in my home because of the level of home care I need?" If you consider the case of Candace Lewis, her mother was so upset that they were pressuring her to euthanasia. Her mother took her home because she thought, well, if Candace is dying, naturally that is if she is dying, then she should die at home. Well, Candace Lewis never died. She continued living. She ended up getting better. But the fact of it is that, is it considered unethical? Of course it is. But so is killing people by euthanasia unethical.
Now, Alex, if Bill C-7 becomes law, is it true that a patient could be killed by their physician even after losing the ability to give instructions, or maybe the patient has even changed his or her mind?
Right. So what the bill does is Bill C-7 allows for euthanasia for someone who's become incompetent, so long as they had been previously approved for euthanasia. So currently, the law says that you must be competent at the time of death. The Bill C-7 would change that. So if you have been approved for euthanasia already, then if they come to you, let's say 3 days later, to give you the injection, and let's say, had a stroke or something and now you're incompetent, you could still be then injected. So you lose the right to change your mind, is the first thing that happens. The second thing is how do you actually know that person now wants to die by euthanasia? You don't know. They've lost their competency. But what's interesting about this is very similar to the one case that happened in the Netherlands. Because in the Netherlands, what happened is there was a case that went to the courts because the doctor had a patient who had asked for euthanasia and had become incompetent and went ahead and did it anyway. But at the time when she was going to do that euthanasia, the patient was resisting and saying no, no, saying no and resisting. So what she had done is she had the family hold her down as she injected her. And of course, then this became a controversy. How could you dare have the family hold her down as you injected her? And the woman was saying no. So this is the kind of thing that you're opening the door to when you allow euthanasia for incompetent people. There's another point to this. I think it's unconstitutional. And the reason I'm saying that is in the Carter decision, which was the court decision that led to the legalization of euthanasia in Canada, the Supreme Court justices said you have to be competent.
Now, Alex, as you mentioned earlier, the bill also removes the requirement that two independent witnesses need to verify the independence of the patient's instruction to receive MAID, and that 10-day waiting period also gone before assisted suicide can actually take place. Why would the government see these as a good thing?
Well, the government has decided to do these things because they had a consultation, but not with the regular group of Canadians. Now, first of all, there was two types of consultations they did. The first one was they did an online consultation last January, and some of your viewers might remember it. I found that consultation, that online consultation, to be very rigged because the questions were designed in such a way to come up with an answer. The questions assumed that someone supported euthanasia. The questions were written in such a way to encourage a certain outcome. The second thing they did is a consultation with the doctors who were doing euthanasia. So there's a group of doctors called the MAID consultation physicians. They're involved with making these decisions and doing the act. So they consulted them, and they were saying, well, the 10-day waiting period is a problem because sometimes someone, can't wait 10 days. Well, the fact of it is the previous law, whether I liked it or not, already allowed for a decision where the doctor could waive the 10-day waiting period. So removing it just didn't make sense. What I'm very concerned about is Bill C-7 is supposed to be a reaction to this Truchon Quebec court decision, which struck down that your natural death had to be reasonably foreseeable. First of all, that was a lower court decision. Secondly, that decision only struck that part of the law out, that your natural death had to be reasonably foreseeable. That's all it struck out. But then the law is now being changed much further than that. And what's important about this is the government actually hasn't done a formal consultation on the law yet. Now, what's my point? The previous law legislated, so when you read the Bill C-14, the law that it passed in 2016, in Section 10 of that law, the legislators added that there must be a formal consultation of the law being done starting in June of 2020. It has not happened. So why is the government changing the law before they've actually done a formal consultation?
Let me ask you something as well. How does the federal government justify expanding euthanasia before doing a 5-year review of the law as previously promised?
Right. The 5-year review is what I was just referring to. Yeah, I called it a formal consultation. The 5-year review is legislated. So therefore, what it says is they must do a full review of the law, and it was supposed to begin in June of 2020. Now I can understand that it hasn't begun yet because of the whole COVID thing that happened, and Parliament, stopped sitting at a certain point, etc. Nonetheless, the fact is to expand the law previous to doing a review of the law seems to me undemocratic because they're not actually examining what's going on. There's a whole nother point to this. The government has been putting out these reports on the law. So the report that came out last year showed that there had been totally up until December of 2019, there had been around 13,900 euthanasia deaths. I predict at this point it's approaching 20,000. But what they had done is, in that, if you read the report, they only reported on the data, meaning the numbers. What was the average age of the person? What was their medical conditions? What part of the country did they come from? Et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. There's nothing in the report that they reported, nothing there that would indicate there was any problems with the law. So in fact, they were creating a, how would you say, a fait accompli. They were creating a report that would lead to an accepted expansion of the law. And I think that's simply wrong.
What about the conscience rights of medical professionals? Alex, can Canadian doctors refuse to participate in euthanasia?
So the conscience rights issue is a serious issue because it differs by province. So for instance, in the province of Ontario, we actually have the worst jurisdiction in the world for the issue of conscience rights. So in Ontario, the Ontario College of Physicians has said that a physician doesn't have to do the act, but they must do something that they call an effective referral. An effective referral means referral for the purpose of the act. So therefore, a doctor who doesn't believe in doing euthanasia, does not believe in lethally injecting their patients, doesn't believe in killing people, that same doctor must, according to the Ontario College of Physicians, send their patient to the person willing to do the act or willing to arrange the act. And of course, if you're not willing to kill somebody, you're not willing to send them to the killer either. So it's become a serious issue in Ontario, this whole issue of the language of the Ontario College of Physicians, this effective referral question. But all provinces in Canada have different positions. So in Manitoba, for instance, Manitoba physicians do not have to do or refer for euthanasia. They just don't have to. They passed a bill in the Manitoba legislature saying that physicians have conscience rights. They do not have to do it. Now, at the same time, most provinces, such as Alberta, etc., have what they call a 1-800 line. They have a toll-free line. So the physicians really don't have to be forced to participate because, in fact, a patient or someone who wants to die by euthanasia, whether I like it or not, can simply call the 1-800 number and be referred to a physician who would do the act. So the fact of it is conscience rights are a serious question. Now, we've lost some physicians in Canada. In my own province of Ontario, there's been several physicians who have left, who I personally know, who have left the province because they believe that they should then be practicing medicine in a place that respected their conscience rights. They weren't willing to do this and they weren't wanting to be forced to do it. Therefore, they've left.
Now, Alex, we only have about a minute left here. Some say next on the list of those allowed to ask for assisted suicide are mature minors. These would be children who are considered mature enough to consent to their own medical treatment. Will the federal government pursue this down the road?
It appears that they're going to be talking about mature minors next, because the whole issue with it is that the Netherlands, for instance, has just announced that they're going to extend their euthanasia to children. But the question is that is it constitutional to deny euthanasia to children? That's the question they're asking. The fact is once they've opened up euthanasia, and they've done so without actually defining the question, they allow it for physical or psychological suffering. They never define psychological suffering. They say that it's going to be for people whose natural death is reasonably foreseeable. They never define natural death as reasonably foreseeable. So when you start getting into all these issues of an undefined law, it sort of starts making sense that children should die too, is what they're saying. And the fact of it is that I think that is the next side of the debate, because they have already expanded it about as far as they can otherwise.
Wow. Alex Schadenberg, Executive Director of Euthanasia Prevention Coalition, thanks for joining me today from London, Ontario.
Thank you very much.